Hey guys, Bax Pair, bringing you some very exciting content today. We have an exclusive first look interview with some Blizzard developers regarding the new Sunline hero talent tree coming into the next expansion, The War Within. Before we jump into the interview itself, just a little bit of background here. So next expansion, we'll get a new set of talent trees, and they're made in a way where each spec shares a talent tree with one other spec. So for DKs, you will have one tree that's shared between Blood and Unholy, one which is Unholy and Frost, and one which is Frost and Blood. And today we're taking a look at the shared tree between Blood and Unholy, which is the Sunline one. I got a initial mock-up right here. So these are very initial kind of tooltips and such. So don't take this as gospel. This is just what we have so far. So if you want to just read that through before we actually go into the interview, please pause the video and do so. I've got an analysis video out as well where I talk about my thoughts about all the talents and so on. But I also make sure to include when we discuss it in the interview so you kind of can reference what talent we're talking about, that kind of thing. Anyway, I'm joined by Meeix, who's a esport kind of presenter and host. And then we have Nate, who's the main tank of Method, who's kind of representing the Blood side, and I'll do the Unholy. And then we're joined by Jade Martin, who's the lead combat designer, and then George Velev, who's the game producer. Anyway, without further ado, let's jump into the interview, and then we'll have a chat afterwards about what I want you guys to do to leave feedback.
Hello everyone, it's Meeix, and today I'm joined by Nate, the main tank of the Raceworld First Guild Method, Biceps Pump, a DK theory crafter and guide writer, and we're joined by George Velev, the game producer, and Jade Martin, lead combat designer, to talk about the new hero talents. It's going to be an evergreen form of character progression, and we're really excited to zone in on the DK talents, specifically the one that crosses over between Unholy and Blood, the Sand Lane. Now, generally speaking, just overarching when it comes to those hero talents, what is your goal in regards to how these talents will affect your class and your spec talents builds?
Yeah, so really the goal of these is to make your class and spec make what you are, but more. You feel like you're playing your spec fundamentally, but with a twist. If you're playing Affliction Warlock, you're still going to be managing dots. None of that's really going to change with hero talent trees. Some of these may give you more rotational changes, or even swap out your rotational abilities, like Vampiric Strike for Sand Lane. Some may give you new buttons, like Holy Armaments for Lightsmith. That being said, we're also trying to be conscious of complexity here. We want hero talents to add fun and new opportunities without creating burdens on your rotation and things like that. On the flip side, there's also 39 of these. There's a lot of these. So the gameplay changes and the amount that they change your rotation will be varied. Some will be more impactful than others, but all of them should feel like you're basically empowering your base class and spec.
Awesome. Now, for the DK class fantasy, I feel like there is a lot of like summoning ghouls and undeads and allies, and even like the Frostworm for Frost DK. Can we look forward to maybe more talents tapping into that design and providing new allies to us, like Blood Beasts, for example?
Yeah, so really cool question. Yeah, when I think of DK, like some of my favorite things are actually, summoning things. I think we look at the season 3 bonus for Unholy, which allows you to summon an additional Magus of the Dead, right? It gives you this really Commander of the Dead feel. And that's really kind of Unholy's niche, whereas a little less so for Frost and Blood at this point in time. But like Blood Beast, as an example, in the Sand Lane tree is actually an opportunity for us to explore that, right? And it makes sense for both Blood and Unholy to summon this Blood Beast, and I think there's something cool there. If we're talking like baseline core abilities that we could see injected into the talent trees, I don't think we have any plans currently, but it is something we've actively talked about, especially for Unholy. Maybe there are some cool things we could do there to inject some of that flavor. But at the moment, don't have too much to talk about there.
We are really conscious of how much space these take up in the play space, so where appropriate, yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, it's a limited resource.
All right. Well, some Unholy specific questions now, if you don't mind. The Infliction of Sorrow talent in the tree builds on the disease aspect of Unholy. Is the disease Unholy something you're looking to expand on in the next expansion?
Yeah, so in the war, good question. So like in Dragonflight, we kind of saw a little bit more incorporation into the Unholy Decay with diseases with Plague Bringer, Morbidity. We saw Virulent, Super Strain come back as well, and so we saw a little bit, but those are kind of mostly passive, right? Like in the grand scheme
Mm.
of things, they don't interact too much. Infliction of Sorrow was a real cool opportunity for us to kind of inject a little bit of shadow fantasy into the Sand Lane tree and give you a little bit more interaction with diseases. When we talk about Unholy's kit, I actually think they do a really good job with like the Commander of the Dead, like summoning ghouls and gargoyle and things like that, and bringing an army to your arsenal. And diseases kind of fall into the wayside a little bit. For me, at least, that's definitely something on top of mind, and I want to maybe see if there's something we can do to explore further expanding that. And actually, Infliction of Sorrow is really kind of the first step towards that as well.
Okay, so as a bit of a follow-up question, are you looking for more interactivity with diseases specifically?
I think we're like similar to the last question, we're applicable when we can inject some of that into the actual spec tree itself. I think that would be nice. Like I think there's room for it in Unholy. I think Sand Lane is like again a step in that direction where we'll see that. I'm interested to hear feedback or we're interested to hear the feedback from the community on how that feels to play around.
Okay, thank you. A very quick one after this one here. Will Vampiric Strike also trigger off Epidemic?
Yeah, I don't think we specifically called it out in the tooltip. That's generally just because things tend to be conditionalized. I'm 90% sure internally because we're already playtesting these. I'm 90% sure it is triggering off of Epidemic. If it's not, it's definitely the intent that it would. We're especially in Dragonflight, I think we've seen that the focus shift where anything that triggers Death Coil will also trigger off of Epidemic because being forced to have something that only triggers off your single target and not your AoE kind of feels bad. And so we've tried to be better about that. Hopefully that's shown through, and I think we should expect the same within the Sand Lane tree.
Okay, thank you. Potentially a bit tricky question here. So, given the strong feedback loop between Scourge Strike and Death Call coming from this hero talent tree, are you worried that other parts of the rotation are going to get a bit pushed out? I'm very much aware that currently wounds kind of doesn't really do a lot of a single target. Do you worry that kind of we're going to end up not actually dealing with those at all?
Yeah, George, you want to take this one? No, I'm just kidding. I won't give that to you. No. This is actually a really good question and definitely something really cognizant of. Generally speaking, I think George actually did touch upon this a little bit where baseline, we don't want to interrupt your co-rotation with hero talent trees. They're really meant there to enhance them more so than anything, maybe inject a little bit of flavorful gameplay, but like completely blowing something out is not ideal, right? And you touched on wounds. Festering Strike is a delivery of those wounds as well, and even Outbreak is very close to being pushed out of the single target rotation. It's like a really fine balancing act at the moment. So that is something that we're very cognizant of. Um, when we're looking at hero talent trees, if we start to identify these things further and they actually becoming problematic, those are things that we want to try and fix baseline, right? Like Festering Strike should feel like something you want to press. Outbreak is something you want to press. I think Infliction of Sorrow it incorporates Outbreak actually a little bit more because of the Virulent Plague application that it gives and how you interact with that with your Vampiric Strike. Like outside of the Gift of the Sand Lane, when you when you Vampiric Strike, it will consume it, right? And when it consumes it, you're going to want to actually apply your Outbreak. That seems like a good outside of Dark Transformation. That seems like a good baseline of the interaction we would expect from these hero talent trees, where outside of your 45-second cooldowns, it's actually okay for you to, consume it with Vampiric Strike and then apply Outbreak. Like it's not going to interrupt your rotation too much. You just have to think a little bit more about what you want to do, right? And so I think that's a fine line to walk. Where it does become a little bit problematic, and I'm sorry, I realize this is a very long-winded answer at this point, but where it does become a little bit problematic is when you're inside your Vampiric Blood or your Dark Transformation, where every single button press you do is probably going to want to consume. You want to use your rune consumption to trigger Infliction of Sorrow, right? To get that extra damage and the extension on the disease. That is good feedback. That's something we're going to want to look at internally. And good feedback from you, like if that feels like that is happening too frequently and like it's just blowing out like your care for frustrating wounds or doing any other mirror rend or anything of those sorts, let us know. Like there's probably some elegant solves we can do there to make sure. And in fact, like Infliction of Sorrow previously it didn't even have that second kicker where it actually consumed inside of Dark Transformation, actually consumed your disease, and that felt even worse because you were like constantly just going back and forth, disease consumed, disease
Right,
consumed,
yeah.
disease consumed, and that just felt bad, right? So we did make a couple of changes there to make sure that it didn't feel super bad, but it's definitely writing that line and something we're cognizant of.
All right, well, thank you very much for the detailed answer. Just a potential clarification here. So, how will the duration of Essence of the Blood Queen work? It implies that refreshing it will actually not add to the duration. Is that true? Is the only way of actually increasing duration to leverage the other talent?
Something we're noticing with these tooltips is that sometimes the amount of information isn't enough. So regarding Essence of Blood Queen, currently the duration of Essence does refresh when you use VB or Dark Transformation. You're guaranteed very high uptime. The intention of the Inside Terror talent is to give you a little bit more breathing room outside of these windows. But honestly, there might be room for like a cap just to make it more palatable. And it's probably something we should consider because caps really help for us on our end to make sure that we're hitting our tuning expectations.
In general, just to like expand on that a little bit, both Unholy and Blood kind of have a lot to manage in terms of buffs and debuffs. So like the intention here wasn't to make like another Festermite or anything like that where you're feeling
Right.
trying. This should feel relatively smooth as you're playing through it, and something that when you don't have Dark Transformation up, when you have the guaranteed Vampiric Strike to get your Essence of the Blood Queen stacked up and continuously rolling, you kind of have a little bit of breathing room, as George mentioned, to make sure that it's lasting long enough between the next prog.
Thank you. Now you both already touched on it just a little bit. There's obviously a lot of new choices coming our way, and while most of the choice nodes we are seeing in the new hero talent trees are passives, is there any word on how we're combating potential like talent convolution or like buff convolution, as you're already saying for like Blood or Unholy here?
Certainly top of mind for us. One of the things that we were trying to sort of avoid with hero talents, one of the reasons we ended up making hero talents in the first place was we looked at our talent trees, going into War Within, and we realized that adding 10 more, points and a few more rows just didn't make sense. We're really happy with how they're currently playing. We don't really feel like it's worth it to sort of upset that balance. So hero talents sort of came in as a way to give us and the community ways to sort of pick bite-sized chunks of fantasy that we can inject into specific classes and specs. Regarding talent convolution, it's definitely top of mind. Something we probably should be talking about a little bit more on our end, but I don't really know if we have anything else to touch on here. Jade, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I mean, talent convolution is definitely something we're thinking about, and it's just a matter of how we want to tackle it, right? Like, I think it was either me or George mentioned earlier, but as we're going through these, there might be instances where we need to adjust the core or the spec tree to better fit our new philosophies. And we're not, and you did notice that there are quite a few passives within the tree, and that's just part of the reason of like we don't want to expand and add a whole bunch of abilities. Like Unholy has a pretty unwieldy opener for a lot of new people to approach. So if we were to completely add a new ability to Sand Lane, for example, you start injecting even more into that, and that's going to feel bad. So we're definitely trying to make sure that we're not doing that. Whereas like Vampiric Strike, as an example, is something that replaces what you're already actively doing. And there are a couple of towns that interject your rotation a little bit, but not, hopefully they don't impact the intent isn't for them to impact your opener on Holy, as an example. And then again, going back to Essence of Blood Queen, right? This isn't something we hopefully doesn't feel like another plate that you feel like you need to spin. This is just something that kind of happens if you're doing your natural rotation. And the cool things that happen with Essence of the Blood Queen are always contained in the further talent trees. And I think you'll see that between all of our other talent trees as the other hero blocks go live, is like these are things we're trying to be cognizant of. We're not trying to increase button bloat or do any of that. Like those are things that we definitely want to improve upon in the future or give different options. When we look at button bloat in general, um, it's good for people who are very high level and they love having those extra buttons, having an answer to every single thing that could possibly happen. That's great. But there are a lot of players, our player base is very diverse. And we want to make sure that people feel like they have something they can go to that isn't asking them to do nearly as much. So like a lot of times what we talk about is I think Brewmaster actually had a couple of updates recently where it was like they got injected a couple of choice nodes where they had an active, but now they also have a passive that does something very similar. And maybe it's not quite as strong, but it's ultimately functionally kind of doing something similar. So a player who's not ready to hit 20 different buttons at any given moment has an option that they feel is more approachable and isn't going to drag their performance down too far. So that's something where we definitely want to make sure um, we're continuing as we go forward with the War Within and hero talents in general.
And
Thank you.
feedback and comments like that, just jump in real
Yeah.
quick. Like this
Speaking-
is the exact point of these sort of articles, right? Like get it out as early as possible, hear people's concerns regarding things like talent convolution or rotations maybe a bit too heavy. We want to know as early as possible. Hero talents are not going to go anywhere. They're an evergreen system. They're going to stick around for quite a while. They're going to grow and evolve over time for sure. So we want to make sure that we're landing these, as solid as we can for the War Within launch.
Speaking of that, of course, we also want to direct people to the feedback blog post. So make sure anybody that's watching this video to go there and leave your feedback there. I'm sure everybody would love to hear it, me included. But we do have some more questions on Blood.
So I guess I'll take it away. So Blood-Soaked Ground was something that piqued my interest quite early on when reading through everything. And it creates, not only for Blood, but for Unholy as well, creates more of an incentive to use Death and Decay in all forms of content. The main point, or point of contention, I guess you can say, for me in regards to Death and Decay gameplay is whenever, whether it be a dungeon or something in open world content or within raid forces you to move outside of it, it can feel quite punishing. Is that is that style of play something that you're looking to emphasize more in the new expansion, or is it just kind of this one-off?
Yeah, so good question. Like when we talk about the other hero DK talent trees in development, I don't think we're trying to look at emphasizing Death and Decay gameplay and standing within that any more than we already do. I think we've seen that increase over time, especially with Dragonflight, Shadowlands, Night Fae. So like I understand that it's increased a little bit. Like it's also a Frost problem. Obviously, they can't be Sand Lane, but it is something that we're very cognizant of. In regards to Blood, it's a little bit more forgiving one because you can kind of dictate where you're going. You also have the proc to gain an additional, basically refund your charge of Death and Decay or Defile. So you have the ability to get back into it relatively quickly, whereas Unholy and Frost, as an example, really don't have that benefit. So it definitely feels worse. Not to discount how it feels on Blood, but I think you at least have tools to at least make it feel a little bit better. It is something we're thinking about very actively. There are some ideas we're exploring that maybe we can do to lighten the blow of being within your Death and Decay, but we wouldn't want to do that. I shouldn't say a blow of your Death and Decay, but the impact of being in your Death and Decay versus being out, I should say. And we wouldn't want to do that in a talent tree though, right? Like that's something we would want to address in the core. And so definitely something we're thinking about. Cleaving strikes is obviously like the big example for both, for all three specs really. And so it's like, there are things that we're thinking about with that talent in particular that maybe we can make it feel a little bit better, but nothing further to announce. I know it's kind of super vague or whatever, but it is top of mind, but we're not ready to really explore what we're thinking there.
Cool. And next thing that sort of came up for me was so you touched briefly on it before in regards to buff extension and maintenance, and that kind of gameplay. And for Blood, that's become, well, with Death and Decay, as well as a couple of other things, it's become a very core element of the spec. Are you concerned at all that the feedback loops from the Sandlion tree could result in a very repetitive style of play? So things that come to mind would be like season 3 and 4 of Shadowlands, where you're just pressing one button over and over again to extend the buff.
Yeah, that's something we don't really like. Season 3, Season 4, Blood DK of Shadowlands, while very powerful, is probably not something we want to see move forward. In fact, there was like very early in Dragonflight beta, that was a style that was coming back. The community was very vocal in that feedback of not necessarily wanting to see that carry forward, and we pulled back on that, right? And why feedback is so important, getting these things in front of people and hearing this again, is definitely important to us. And so if we feel like the buff extension and the maintenance gameplay here of what Sandlane is asking you to do is just spam Heart Strike over and over again to make sure that this is 100% uptime, we're probably missing the mark there. That's definitely not the intention of, say, Insight Terror, which is what the extension for Essence of the Blood Queen is. That's not the intention. I think that is probably a very good reason for this to actually have a cap on it, so that you know, maybe it's like you hit Heart Strike 4 times and that's enough within the window, and you're not going to get any more extension. The nice thing about that is, you know, if we do put a cap on it, we can actually make the extension quite a bit meatier, right? It could be, you know, let's say 3 seconds instead of a half second. So you actually feel it more than you would otherwise. And generally probably just makes for a better talent. So that's something I'll bring back to the team and talk about when we're talking about this type of Insight Terror. I think that would be a good change. And again, by having these talks and having these feedbacks and these blogs going out early is going to be very important for us.
Course. And then just for the last point for myself, would be the Sandlane capstone. So Gift of the Sandlane. It incentivizes blood decay. Well, in particular, to use Vampiric Blood as an offensive cooldown. Is that a trend that we can expect to continue, or is that again just a one-off?
Before I jump in, what do you think of that? Do you like that?
What I think of that?
Yeah.
But yeah, so personally, I enjoy that style of gameplay. But I do know a portion of the player base does not. And the first thing that comes to mind for myself would be Shadowlands. With gonna drift away from DK a tiny bit, would be Vengeance Demon Hunter with their Venfear Covenant ability, if you remember that at all. It made them use Metamorphosis offensively rather than as a defensive cooldown, and that could feel pretty frustrating. So hopefully, with Vampiric Blood being such a low cooldown, it shouldn't really create too much of a negative effect, because we've already had it in season 2 of Dragonflight, where the tier set incentivized that as well. But using big cooldowns offensively instead of defensively, I can see why it would be frustrating for some.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for that feedback. Really appreciate it. And certainly agree that it's a bit contentious, tying a defensive cooldown to an offensive talent. We've explored, you know, things like this in the past, like you mentioned. We generally like it, but in the case of Sandlane, you know, there's room to tie it to something like Dancing Rune Weapon, which is defensive, but also has more offensive capabilities built into it. Certain things we talk about quite often.
I think that's a really good point, actually, is tying it to a cooldown that's both offensive and defensive. It's a really good idea.
Nice.
Yeah, good idea, George. A great idea.
I'll write it down.
But I think like in terms of George, you know, or we've kind of talked about it, but the impact and the actual cooldown of the ability plays a large role in what a defensive to a turning a defensive cooldown into an offensive cooldown. What the actual impact of that talent is, what the actual cooldown of it is if we're asking too much, right? Like Vampiric Blood, you can get down with relatively low depending on how you're speccing out, right? So it probably is okay in that regard, but maybe it's not. Maybe at that, you know, maybe Dancing Rune Weapon, but maybe that locks you into a talent build, right? And that just feels maybe a little too bad. So maybe Dancing Rune Weapon is a better driver for that. So good idea, George. We'll take it back to the team.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. We do have one more kind of cheeky question to round this interview out. Now, of course, we talked mostly about the Sandlane, but we do know the names of the 2 other hero talents already. Rider of the Apocalypse and Deathbringer just sound really badass, to be honest. Is there anything you can tell us about those?
Yeah, their names are super badass.
The great names. Yeah.
We don't have a lot to share right now. Those ones are actually still pretty early in development, but our goal is to actually have the majority of our hero talents in for the first public testing of these. And we're planning to also do more hero blogs in the future as well. So hopefully players will, if you don't get a chance to play it as early as others, you'll at least be able to look at the blogs and get a rough sense of what they're going to do. But yeah, we're excited about those ones too. Rider is my personal favorite, so I'm looking forward to seeing what people think of that.
Yeah, no spoilers either, but I'm really excited for Rider Apocalypse.
Wow, now I want to know it even more. Great job, both of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I, for one, love when we get the chance to talk to devs, when we get those kind of blog posts, to get that information. I think it's really valuable to a lot of players and kind of shows us that you want to hear what we have to say and what we think on stuff. So shout out for doing that, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us. I don't know if Biceps or Nate want to add anything else.
I think it's
Personally,
very valuable to hear your point of view to direct feedback in a better way. Because if we have an idea what you're kind of trying to do, it's much easier for us to kind of give the feedback we feel has the most impact.
yeah, I mean, if we like an important part is feedback through multiple different avenues, just making sure that like as long as the feedback is out there, it's feedback that can be listened to by not only yourselves but multiple different people. And so therefore it's really important to just create that flow of information from us as the players towards you as the developers.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, like we digest a bunch of mediums for different types of feedback, whether it's YouTube videos, George loves TikTok, written forum feedback, Discords, you know, anywhere we can actually get that feedback's important. Written tends to be easier for us to parse through, so that's generally our most preferred. But again, you know, any type of feedback is good feedback. And like just to sum it up, actually, like the types of things we're looking for, if this is helpful at all, is like we really want to know about, you know, how you feel about the fantasy of the tree. How well do the talents embody it, right? What are your thoughts on how the talents will play and the impact of their rotation? You know, what is the impression of the talents and how it'll affect your different class and spec builds? And also like names and visuals, like that's a big part of hero talents and selling that fantasy. So like knowing those types of things and how, if we're hitting the mark there, is really important to us. So like any feedback is welcome, but those, you know, those 4 or 5 points right there is really what we're looking for and would be really helpful to us.
Especially if something feels too heavy or too burdensome to your rotation, that's really good feedback to know. And honestly, since we're doing these so early, we are giving ourselves a wide avenue for changes. And honestly, I can't plus one you enough, Nate. Like feedback is pivotal to development. We can't really make the game without everyone's feedback and contributions, things like that. And to Jade's point, yeah, if you make a TikTok about Sand Lane feedback, I will probably watch it.
I got you.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Love me a good TikTok.
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's everything from us. We were so much faster than we anticipated. Thank you so much for the elaborate answers on all of the questions. I'm sure many people can appreciate that. And also thank you again to Biceps and Nate for joining. Love to have you guys both here.
Yeah,
That's
thank you
it,
guys.
I think.
Thanks for
Was
having
great.
us. It
Thank
was a
you
pleasure.
so much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
Thank you guys.
All right. Hope you guys enjoyed that. As we said in the interview, there is a blog post out, and we very much, or the developers very much want you to provide your feedback about your initial thoughts about this. So head over there, let them know. Do you like this? Is the fantasy in the right spot? Are you worried about any specific talents causing any issues? That kind of thing. Just leave your feedback. I'm sure they'll listen. And this is like your chance to be heard about a very initial look. So link is in the description. Use that. Go to the blog post. Leave your feedback. And go with that. Upvote, downvote, consider subscribing. I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.